You sit across from someone at dinner, and they're telling you about their weekend. The drama at work, the argument they had, the anxiety spiraling through their chest about something that might happen next month. Their voice rises and falls with emotional peaks and valleys. Their hands gesture wildly. Their eyes search yours for validation, for reaction, for proof that you're engaged and you are listening. You are present, but something has shifted in you. You're not matching their energy. You're not riding the wave of their emotional turbulence. You're not offering the enthusiastic reactions they seem to expect. You're calm, steady, and in their eyes, for just a flicker of a moment, you see it. Disappointment, maybe even judgment. You seem boring to them now. Flat, unexciting, like something vital has drained out of you. Or maybe it happens differently. You're scrolling through your phone and nothing grabs you anymore. The outrage bait, the shocking headlines, the perfectly curated lives, the artificial urgency of everything. It all slides past you like water off glass. Your friends send you memes that used to make you laugh until your stomach hurt, and now you smile politely but feel nothing. You go to the party everyone's been talking about, and while everyone around you is getting louder, more animated, chasing that next dopamine spike through another drink, another story, another desperate attempt to feel something, you're standing there quiet, observing, not judging them, not superior, just genuinely unmoved by what used to move you. And you start to wonder if something is wrong with you, if you've lost some essential human capacity, if you've become boring. You look at your own life from the outside and it seems smaller now, quieter. The peaks aren't as high. You don't chase experiences the way you used to. You don't need the chaos, the intensity, the constant stimulation. You've stopped trying to fill every silence, stopped needing validation for every thought, stopped performing your existence for an audience. And the world around you interprets this as loss, as depression, maybe, as giving up, as becoming less. People who used to find you magnetic now seem to drift away. Not dramatically, just gradually, like they've lost interest in a show that's become too slow, too quiet, too boring. And here's the question that haunts you in the middle of the night. Have you lost something precious? Have you become one of those people who just gave up on joy, on excitement, on really living? Is this peace you feel actually just emotional death wearing a pleasant mask? But what if I told you that what's happening to you is not loss, but evolution? That you haven't become boring, you've become healed. And that the world's perception of you as boring is not a diagnosis of your deficiency, but a measurement of its own addiction. Let me explain something about the nature of stimulation and why our entire culture is structured around a form of collective emotional self-harm that we've convinced ourselves is vitality. For most of your life, you operated in what I call the stimulation economy. This is the unspoken agreement that aliveness equals intensity, that feeling means feeling strongly, that presence requires constant engagement with peaks and valleys of emotional experience. In this economy, peace is worthless, calm is poverty, stillness is death. The currency is reaction, drama, excitement, anxiety, outrage, pleasure, pain, anything that moves the needle on your internal emotional meter. And you spent years, maybe decades, learning to generate this currency. You learned to manufacture crises to feel important. You learned to seek conflict to feel engaged. You learned to chase pleasure to feel alive. You learned to perform emotions you didn't quite feel to prove you were feeling them. This wasn't conscious. This wasn't some moral failing. This was survival in a world that measures human value by emotional output. The person who feels nothing is invisible. The person who feels everything is fascinating. So you learned to feel everything, or to perform feeling everything, which, after enough time, becomes indistinguishable from actually feeling it. But here's what nobody tells you about the stimulation economy. It has the same structure as any addiction. It requires escalation. The same level of stimulation that lit you up at 20 barely registers at 30. The drama that used to consume you for weeks now bores you in hours. The pleasures you once chased with desperate hunger now taste like ash, not because you're broken, but because you've built a tolerance. Your nervous system has adapted to constant intensity and now requires more and more stimulation to feel anything at all. And if this sounds familiar, you know what I'm talking about. That slow, horrifying realization that nothing touches you the way it used to. That you've become numb in the pursuit of feeling. Schopenhauer understood this. He called it the pendulum of suffering, swinging eternally between pain and boredom. We suffer when we lack what we desire, and we're bored when we attain it. The solution most people choose is to swing harder, chase more intensely, escalate the stakes. But this isn't a solution, it's just faster swinging. The pendulum remains, the structure remains. You remain trapped in it, exhausting yourself in motion that goes nowhere. Now, if you're still following me, consider staying. We explore these depths every single week, and if this is already hitting different, you know where the subscribe button is. The image I want you to hold is this. Imagine you've been living your entire life in a room with strobing lights. Rapid pulses of brightness and darkness, constantly shifting, never still. You were born into this room. Everyone you know lives in rooms just like it. And after years of this, you've learned to navigate by the strobe. You've learned to time your movements to the pulses. You've learned to find meaning in the patterns of light and dark. Your entire sense of sight, of presence, of being alive is structured around these rapid oscillations. Then one day, the strobing stops. The light becomes steady, constant, still. At first, this feels like blindness. The steady light seems like no light at all because it doesn't pulse, doesn't change, doesn't give you those familiar spikes of brightness to orient around. You stumble, you panic, you think something has broken in you or in the world. You try desperately to make the strobe come back. You start generating your own chaos, your own drama, your own artificial peaks and valleys because the steady light feels like death. But if you stop trying to recreate the strobe, if you just sit in the steady light for long enough, something extraordinary happens. Your eyes adjust, and you start to see things you've never seen before. Details, textures, depth, colors that don't exist in strobe light. The steady light reveals a richness that the constant oscillation made invisible. You start to realize that what you called sight before wasn't sight at all. It was just reaction to stimulation. A nervous system jerking in response to environmental chaos. You weren't seeing, you were convulsing. This is what's happening when you become boring to a world addicted to stimulation. Your eyes are adjusting to steady light. You're starting to see what's actually there instead of just reacting to what's flashing in your face. And to everyone still living in the strobe, you look blind, you look dead, you look boring. Because here's the thing, they can't see. You're not experiencing less, you're experiencing more. But you're experiencing it in a register they can no longer perceive. The depth, the texture, the subtle beauty of steadiness is invisible to someone who's still jerking in response to the strobe. They think intensity equals feeling. They think stimulation equals life. They think your peace is absence. But you know differently now, don't you? You know that what they're calling your boredom is actually your presence. What they're calling your flatness is actually your depth. What they're calling your lack of reaction is actually your capacity to finally respond instead of just reacting. This is what happened to you. The strobe stopped, not because you gave up on life, but because your nervous system couldn't sustain that level of artificial intensity anymore. It wasn't a choice. It was a collapse of an unsustainable system. And in that collapse, in what felt like death, something else became possible. Now here's where most people make a catastrophic mistake. They feel this shift happening, this movement away from intensity towards steadiness, and they panic. They interpret it as loss, as depression, as diminishment. And they do everything in their power to get the strobe back. They chase harder. They seek out more extreme experiences. They manufacture drama where none exists. They pick fights, start projects they don't care about, dive into relationships that are obviously doomed. Anything to get that familiar spike of feeling, that proof that they're still alive. This is like someone who's been poisoning themselves slowly for years. And when their body finally starts to detox, they interpret the withdrawal symptoms as evidence that they need more poison. The shaking, the discomfort, the flatness, they think this means they need to go back to what was killing them. They don't understand that what they're feeling is healing, not dying. Let me tell you what actually happens when you try to force the strobe back on. You chase intensity, but now it takes more to get the same effect. So you escalate. You take bigger risks, create bigger dramas, seek out more extreme forms of stimulation, and for a moment, it works. You feel that familiar spike, that proof of aliveness, but it fades faster now, and it leaves you more empty than before. Because you're not just numb to the previous level of stimulation, you're numb to this new level too. You're building tolerance in real time. You're training your nervous system to need more and more intensity just to feel baseline normal. This is the hedonic treadmill, but it's worse than that. It's the hedonic escalator. It only goes one direction. Up, toward more, toward harder, toward eventually destroying yourself in the pursuit of feeling something. And here's what you must understand. This escalation is not proof that you need more stimulation. It's proof that stimulation itself is the problem. The hunger for intensity is not satisfied by more intensity. It's created by it. So, what's the alternative? What do you do when the strobe stops and everyone around you thinks you're dying, but you're starting to suspect you might actually be coming alive for the first time? First, you need to understand what's actually happening. This shift you're experiencing, this movement from intensity to steadiness, it has a name. It's called hedonic maturation. Not hedonic adaptation, which is just your nervous system getting used to pleasure. This is different. This is your nervous system evolving beyond the need for pleasure as proof of life. This is the development of a capacity to exist in what I call affective neutrality without absence. Let me break that down because it's important. Affective neutrality means emotional steadiness, not numbness, not absence of feeling, but the absence of the need for emotional peaks and valleys to prove you're feeling. It's the difference between the ocean and a puddle. A puddle is dramatic, it splashes, it responds violently to every stone thrown into it. The ocean is steady, but the ocean contains depths the puddle can't imagine. That steadiness isn't absence of life, it's concentration of it. Most people experience emotional flatness as depression because they've only ever known intensity as proof of aliveness. So when intensity fades, they think life is fading, but what's actually fading is the addiction to intensity. What's emerging underneath is something more fundamental, presence, being, existence that doesn't require constant stimulation to prove itself. This state has qualities that seem paradoxical if you're still operating in the stimulation economy. It's deeply peaceful, but not passive. It's profoundly present, but not reactive. It's emotionally steady, but not numb. It experiences pleasure without needing it. It experiences pain without drowning in it. It exists in the world without needing the world to constantly confirm that it's existing. Here's what this actually looks like in practice. You're in a conversation and someone is trying to provoke you. Push your buttons, get a rise out of you. In the old system, you would react. Your emotional temperature would spike. You'd feel that familiar surge of intensity, anger, or defensiveness, or excitement. And you'd engage, escalate, perform the emotional dance they're inviting you into. But now, you feel the provocation land. You notice it, you're aware of it, and you just don't take the bait. Not because you're repressing your reaction, not because you're trying to be spiritual or enlightened or above it all. You just genuinely don't feel the pull toward that drama anymore. It's not interesting to your nervous system. It's like watching someone try to sell you something you already owned and discarded years ago. And this is where people start to think you're boring. Because in a world addicted to reaction, non-reaction looks like absence. They throw the bait and you don't bite, and they interpret that as you not having teeth anymore. But you know differently, you have teeth. You're just not hungry for what they're feeding. If you're still with me, and I can tell you are, maybe you've been realizing that what you thought was wrong with you is actually something profound happening through you. We go deeper into this territory every week. You know what to do if you want more. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Marcus. Marcus was, by all external measures, the most alive person in any room. Quick wit, sharp observations, always at the center of the action. He was the one who turned every gathering into an event, every conversation into performance. People were drawn to him because being around him felt like being more alive. His intensity was contagious. But what nobody saw, what Marcus barely admitted to himself, was that maintaining that intensity was exhausting him. It wasn't natural. It was a constant effort. A performance he couldn't stop performing because his entire identity was built on being the intense one, the alive one, the exciting one. Then Marcus went through something that cracked him open. Not a dramatic crisis, just a sustained period of loss. Small losses accumulated, a relationship ended, a job he cared about dissolved. A friendship he'd invested in revealed itself as one-sided, nothing catastrophic, but enough to drain his reserves. And one day, he just didn't have the energy to perform anymore. He went quiet, not depressed. Exactly, not broken. Just profoundly tired of pretending that constant stimulation felt like living. His friends were concerned. They tried to pull him back into the old patterns. They'd invite him to parties and he'd go, but he'd stand in the corner, observing, not performing. They'd try to provoke him into his old sharp-witted banter, and he'd just smile softly and not take the bait. They started describing him to others as going through something, as if his peace was a phase, as if his steadiness was a symptom. But something was happening to Marcus that he couldn't quite articulate. The world hadn't become less, it had become more. He was noticing things he'd never noticed before because he'd always been too busy reacting to notice. The texture of silence, the depth of simple presence, the relief of not having to constantly generate proof of his aliveness for an audience. He'd thought the intensity was him. He was discovering that the steadiness underneath was more him than the performance had ever been. One night, a close friend confronted him. "You're not yourself anymore," she said. And Marcus realized she was right, but not in the way she meant. He wasn't the self he'd constructed. He was finally becoming the self that didn't need construction. But he couldn't explain this to her, because she was still living in the strobe light, and steady light looks like darkness to eyes that haven't adjusted yet. The last time I heard about Marcus, he'd lost touch with most of that social circle. Not through conflict, just through natural drift. They found him boring, and he found them exhausting. He'd built a quieter life, smaller, less dramatic. And he described it as the first time he'd ever felt like he could breathe. The first time aliveness didn't require constant effort. The first time he existed without having to prove he existed. This is what's happening to you. You're in the middle of the process Marcus went through. That moment where the old self is dying, and the new self hasn't fully emerged yet, so mostly you just feel like you're dying. Like something essential is being lost. But here's what you need to understand. What's dying is the performance. What's dying is the addiction. What's dying is the exhausting necessity of proving your aliveness through intensity. And yes, it feels like death because something real is dying. The false self dies hard because it's been running the show for so long that you confused it with your actual self. But underneath that death, something is being born. Something that doesn't need external stimulation to exist. Something that can be present without being reactive. Something that can experience the fullness of life without requiring life to be constantly full. Think about it like this. You know those trees that survive forest fires? Their seeds actually require fire to germinate. The heat cracks open the shell that protected the seed, and only after the fire, in the ash and the devastation, can the new tree begin to grow. You are that seed. The fire was the collapse of your capacity to sustain intensity. The ash is this period where you seem boring to everyone around you. And what's germinating underneath is something that couldn't have grown while the old forest was still standing. This is not comfortable. Nobody tells you that healing feels like dying. That peace feels like boredom. That steadiness feels like flatness. The transformation from intensity-dependent aliveness to intrinsic aliveness requires passing through a valley that looks and feels like death. And you are in that valley now? This is not a mistake. This is not evidence that something is wrong. This is how it works. The caterpillar doesn't become the butterfly through gentle evolution. It becomes soup first. Complete dissolution of the old form before the new form can emerge. So, what do you actually do in this valley? How do you navigate this space between the death of the false self and the emergence of the real one? First, and this is critical, you stop trying to get the intensity back. Every time you feel that pull toward drama, toward manufactured crisis, toward artificial stimulation, you recognize it for what it is, the addiction trying to survive. And you don't feed it. Not through willpower or repression, but through clear seeing. You see the pattern trying to reassert itself, and you just don't participate. You let the impulse arise, you acknowledge it, and you let it pass without acting on it. Second, you develop tolerance for being uninteresting to others. This is harder than it sounds, because your social survival has been tied to being interesting for most of your life. But you're going to have to learn to exist in other people's perception of you as boring, without internalizing that as truth. They think you're boring because their eyes haven't adjusted to steady light yet. That's information about them, not about you. Third, you start paying attention to what's actually present when you're not chasing stimulation. This is subtle work. You're learning to perceive in a different register. The richness of the present moment isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't announce itself. It's there in the texture of experience when you're not demanding that experience be intense. It's in the simple fact of breathing, the weight of your body in space, the ambient sound of existence, the understated miracle of being at all. Fourth, you stop waiting for this to feel good in the way intensity used to feel good. It won't. This isn't another peak, this is the ground, and ground doesn't spike, ground is steady. The relief you feel isn't the spike of pleasure, it's the relief of not needing the spike anymore. It's the peace of not being hungry all the time. And that peace might feel like nothing to a nervous system trained to measure aliveness by intensity, but it's not nothing, it's everything. It's just everything in a register you haven't learned to hear yet. And here's the thing, if you've made it this far in this exploration, you already know this isn't surface-level content. We go into these territories every week, and if you want to keep going deeper, you know what to do. Fifth, you let people drift away without chasing them. The people who found you interesting because of your intensity will lose interest as you become steady. This is going to hurt. But chasing them, trying to prove you're still interesting, performing the old intensity to keep them engaged, that's just feeding the addiction. Let them go. Not with bitterness, not with judgment, just with clear recognition that they're in a different place, and that's okay. The people who can meet you in steadiness will appear, but they can't appear while you're still performing intensity. Sixth, and this might be the most important, you stop comparing your internal experience to other people's external presentation. Everyone around you is performing aliveness, posting their adventures, their dramas, their intense emotional experiences, and it's going to look like they're living more fully than you are. But you have to remember, you know what that performance costs because you lived it. You know the exhaustion underneath the intensity? You know the emptiness underneath the constant stimulation? They're not more alive than you, they're just louder. And loud isn't the same as real. Finally, you accept the fundamental paradox. The only way to become genuinely alive is to stop trying to feel alive. The hunger for intensity is what blocks access to depth. The addiction to stimulation is what makes presence impossible. Peace doesn't feel like aliveness to someone addicted to intensity, but peace is actually what aliveness feels like when it doesn't have to prove itself anymore. Now, here's what most people don't understand about this transformation. It's not that you stop feeling dead. It's not that you become numb or disconnected or passively accepting of everything. You actually feel more, but you feel it differently. You feel the full spectrum of human emotion, but you're not drowning in it anymore. You're not identified with it. Joy arises and you experience it fully, without needing it to last forever. Pain arises and you experience it fully without needing it to stop immediately. Anger, sadness, contentment, grief, peace, they all move through you without requiring you to perform them, amplify them, or suppress them. This is what Epicurus understood when he distinguished between kinetic pleasure and static pleasure. Kinetic pleasure is what our culture is addicted to, the pleasure of getting what you want, of satisfying desire, of intensity and stimulation. But Epicurus argued that the highest form of pleasure is static pleasure, the pleasure of simply existing in a state of non-suffering, of peace, of being without lacking. Not the excitement of the feast, but the quiet satisfaction of not being hungry. Our culture has completely forgotten this distinction. We've collapsed all pleasure into kinetic pleasure, all aliveness into intensity, all presence into reaction, and we've pathologized static pleasure as depression. We've decided that if you're not constantly pursuing, constantly stimulated, constantly reacting, you must be dying. But what Epicurus understood, what you're beginning to understand, is that the hunger itself is the suffering. The addiction to intensity is the problem. And the solution is not more intensity. It's the cultivation of a state where you don't need intensity to feel like you're existing. This is why you seem boring now. You're no longer hungry in the way that drives constant pursuit. You're no longer empty in the way that requires constant filling. You're discovering static pleasure, the pleasure of being rather than becoming, of existing rather than striving. And to a world that has completely forgotten this is possible, you look like you've given up. But you haven't given up. You've stopped running. And those are completely different things. Think about what's been happening in you since you started reading this. That recognition, that relief, that sense of being seen in something you couldn't articulate, that's not coming from the words. The words are just pointing. What you're recognizing is already in you. This shift has already happened. You're already in the steady light. You've just been conditioned to interpret it as darkness because your eyes haven't fully adjusted yet. The world will continue to find you boring. Your friends will continue to drift. Your social media presence will probably fade because you're not performing intensity anymore. None of this means you're doing it wrong. All of this is evidence that you're doing it right. You're exiting a system that required constant performance, and the system is responding to your exit by withdrawing its validation. This is how systems protect themselves. They make leaving look like losing. But here's what the system can't touch: the quality of your actual experience, the depth of your actual presence, the reality of your actual existence underneath all the performance. That's yours. That's real. And it doesn't require anyone's validation because it's not a performance. It's just what's there when you stop performing. So, when you're sitting alone on a Friday night and everyone you used to know is out chasing intensity and you're home in the quiet, and that voice in your head whispers that you've become boring, that you've lost something precious, that you're wasting your life, remember this: that voice is the addiction. That voice is the old system trying to survive. That voice thinks life is somewhere else, somewhere louder, somewhere more intense. But life is exactly where you are. It's always been exactly where you are. You just couldn't perceive it through all the noise. And if this entire exploration has been resonating with you in ways that feel both uncomfortable and true, consider that maybe you're exactly where you need to be. We examine these depths every week, and if you're tired of surface-level explanations for what you're experiencing, maybe it's time to stay. You know where the subscribe button is? You haven't become boring. You've become real, and real is quiet. Real is steady. Real doesn't perform itself. Real doesn't require constant validation. Real doesn't spike and crash. Real just is. And after a lifetime of noise, of intensity, of constant performance, real feels like nothing because you've never felt it before. But give it time. Let your eyes adjust. Let your nervous system recalibrate to steady light instead of strobe. Let yourself exist without needing to prove you exist. What you're experiencing isn't the death of aliveness. It's the death of the addiction to intensity that you confused with aliveness. And underneath that death, something is emerging that doesn't need anything from the world to exist. Something that can be present without being reactive. Something that can experience fullness without requiring constant filling. Something that is genuinely, finally, exhaustingly, beautifully alive without having to work at it anymore. The paradox resolves like this: in a world addicted to stimulation, peace looks like death. But peace is actually what life feels like when it stops trying to prove itself. You seem boring to them because they're still measuring aliveness by intensity. But you know better now. You know that the deepest aliveness is quiet, that presence is steady, that real existence doesn't require performance. You were never boring. You just stopped being loud. And loud was never what mattered anyway.